book of Genesis, Genesis 25. To lay the background just for a second or two, Sarah has just passed away. Abraham, in the previous chapter, has purchased some property from the people of Heth, also called Hittites. And this was a property, I don't know how many acres it happened to be, but it's in that field that he purchased was a cave, and that's where he wanted to bury his wife's body, at Cave of Machpelah. This gets to be rather famous later on as a burial place for a number of members of the family, including Isaac and Jacob, etc. So now in chapter 25, what we have is Abraham is 140 years old, which is more like our time today. I mean, you subtract about 40 from that, and we have people living to be 100 plus years. So this is drastically reduced longevity from what it was back in Noah's day. Noah was 600 years. Of course, a tremendous amount from Methuselah's time, 969. But Abram was he was about 140 years old, and this is about 1800 years BC. So perhaps that's enough on time. We'll pick some of those issues up a little bit later. Abraham was left alone. His son Isaac married Rebekah, and they were living down at, a little bit south of what we call Laharoy. That's where one of the many wells that Abraham dug was, and so they took up that particular area and lived there. I don't know, here he is by himself. His wife has died, years have passed, wasn't immediately, but notice verse 1. Then, after some passage of time, Abraham took a wife, her name was Keturah, and she bore unto him 6 sons. I don't know if there's any daughters involved, but we do know that there were 6 boys. Question. Doesn't it not seem unlikely that Abraham married a Canaanite woman? I say that because, turn back to chapter, 20. Genesis, previous chapter. There it says Abraham was old, well stricken in age, and then Abraham calls his servant in and says, I want you to go to the homeland of our family. Now, many, many years have passed, possibly 80 or 90 years have passed since he had seen his brother. He had 2 boys, Haran and Nahor. Haran had already died down there in Ur of the Chaldees, so there's just 2 left. And you've got Abraham and Nahor. But Abraham, being well aged at this time, is concerned about a son, Isaac, having a wife. And so he says in verse 4, I want you to go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. The man says, well, let's suppose that she's not willing to come back with me. What then? That's verse 5. Abraham said, beware that you do not bring my son there again. In fact, he says in verse 3, I want you to take a wife for my son, not here of the Canaanite people, but back among my relatives, my kinfolk, verse 4. So look at verse 6. Abraham said, do not bring my son there again. And then he mentions again in verse 8, if the woman that you select is not willing to come back, then you are free from this oath that you've just taken, that you will go and bring back one of these relatives of ours, from Nahor, my brother. And so the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, and he swore this oath, that that's what he'll do. Twice then, verse 6 and verse 8, he's very clear. Abraham says, do not bring my son back to Canaan, or this woman has to be from our relatives. We talked a little bit about that, so that's where we are at this particular time. It's around 1800. Abraham is concerned that his son's going to marry a Canaanite woman, and so he says this in regard to his son. He didn't want his son to marry a Canaanite woman. Okay, now, Abraham's wife dies. Abraham is alone. Abraham is lonely. He begins looking around for a companion. Is she a Canaanite? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but it does seem unlikely, since he was so specific, at least twice saying, don't do this. We don't want the wife to come from these people. So it seems that probably she came from someone that'd be more compatible, but we simply don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. It's silent regarding her background. But from what he had to say regarding his son, Isaac, it would seem that he wouldn't be. I know it's a different situation because we're worried, we're concerned about the Messiah coming of the Messianic line. Abraham's worried about that when this companion or wife is taken for his son. We know her name, Rebecca, later. Okay, Abraham has some more children. He gets married to Keturah. Time passes. I don't know how long, I would say probably 10 years or more. At least 6 boys are born to this union. Now, does this not seem odd, since Abraham was really too old to have children, and his wife was also too old to bear children. But God has said it's going to be from you, Abraham, and he told Sarah the same thing, it'll be from you. So this relationship, her idea of helping God out by using her handmaid, Hagar, Abraham, take her and have a child by my handmaid, and this way we'll have an heir. God doesn't need her help. God can take care of the situation without man going against God's will. But anyway, God did restore Abraham's reproductive ability prior to Isaac being born, obviously. Even though he was considered too old to have children, you can see this in the book of Hebrews, yet he was restored and capable of fathering a child. And evidently, that lasted the rest of his life. Why do I say that? Because he gets married again to Keturah and has 6 more children, which is going to take a number of years, 8 or 10 years or more, probably. So that explains why Keturah was able to have children by Abraham, because when God made him virile and made him capable of begetting a child, and they had Isaac, that wasn't a one-time deal. That was from then on to the end of his life. In other words, when God works a miracle, it's more permanent than we may think. Okay, I don't need to get into the mention of the children's name except one of them. Look at verse 4. One of those 6 boys was named Midian, but it's also there in verse number 2. Midian. The reason I bring his name up is because in the future we're going to run into some people called the Midianites. And they're going to be a real burr in the saddle, a thorn in the flesh to Israel, to the descendants of Abraham through Jacob. They seem to have gone together with the Ishmaelites, you know, Abraham's boy, the oldest child, with Hagar. They seem to be together, allies together with the Ishmaelites and the Moabites and the Amalekites. Throw the Midianites in there with them, because they all seem to be able to be compatible to each other from other verses like in Numbers and later on in Judges. Okay, chapter 25 and verse 5. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, with the exceptions mentioned in the next verse. To the sons of the concubines, and notice that that's what he calls Keturah and Hagar. Sarah was his wife, and Hagar was a handmaiden of Sarah, serving as a concubine. He calls Keturah a concubine here. Kind of an interesting thing to mention in passing. But anyway, look what he does. Verse 6. He gave them gifts, and he sent them away from Isaac. He's separating them from Isaac, wanting them to not have a close relationship, evidently. And while he yet lived, he sent them toward the east. And then specifically it says the east country. To get more specific than that, we'll mention probably where this was. But he goes on to mention some other names. Abraham lives 115 years, verse 7 tells us. So he's 175 years old now. He gives up the ghost. He dies in a good old age. You don't have to be 600 years old to be an old age person now. You call it an old fella when you're 175. Full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Now, what does that mean? Gathered unto his people. I don't think that it means buried in the same cemetery. I think it means more than that, because he's talking more than just death having occurred and being placed, his corpse placed in a similar place. He was gathered unto his people. It would probably be referring to the fact that following death, a person still exists. Now remember, Job had asked earlier, if a man die, shall he live again? Job 14:14. We know a lot more about death and after death because of the New Testament than Job did. We know more than Abraham did. But here is a hint, very possibly we're talking about Abraham being not the corpse, the body, but Abraham being gathered together with his people. And I think it's interesting also to realize that 1900 years later, over in the book of Luke, Luke writes in chapter 16, verse 22, he writes about some death and then mentions Abraham's bosom. It's what it's called there, Abraham's bosom. But now Isaac is the only surviving link in this messianic line through which Christ will be coming hundreds of years yet in the future. Okay, I'm not going to go into all the names that are mentioned here in verses 12 through 15. But it says in verse 16, these are the sons of Ishmael, the half-brother of Isaac, 14 years older than Isaac, remember. And here they are listed by their towns, by their names, and by their castles. 12 princes according to their nations. And then it says the years of Ishmael were 137 years. Now his mom, Sarah, lived 127. He lives 137 years. He died, and he was gathered unto his people. And notice they dwell from Havilah unto Shur. And he sort of speaks here of a map, you might think. Whenever you tell somebody, they come up and say, can you tell me where Dollar General is? Well, it kind of depends on where you are, but you'll say, well, you go over here to 8th Street, and then you go down to Oklahoma and take a turn to the west and go a few blocks, and it's on your right. But listen to this statement. It says, verse 18, Havilah and Shur were before Egypt as you're going toward Assyria. So if you're heading Assyria, which would be north and east, he's giving directions. It is before Assyria. As you leave Egypt and you go up toward Assyria, and then here's where it's located. Okay, then he died, and it's also mentioned that he was gathered unto his people, which to me, again, I'm assuming this, it doesn't say, but I'm assuming that we're talking about the same place. More than likely we are, and if that's true, life after death. He's talking here about Ishmael probably being a believer in God. After all, he was raised in the home of Abraham for years. He was circumcised by Abraham. So he was a believer in God. Anyway, the same statement is made about him as we had earlier about Abraham. Now the birthright. We always, things seem to be going just right and then something happens. That's life. Life is knowing how to react to a number of experiences and yet keep your head about you. Isaac is about 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Rebekah was his second cousin. Abraham's brother Nahor, and then Bethuel, and then Rebekah. So notice that's Genesis 25 verse 20 and also 26. Here it said that Sarah, not Sarah. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel. Notice Bethuel is here called Assyrian, which is interesting. And she was a sister to Laban the Syrian. Anyway, she wasn't able to have children, and so she prayed to God. You see this not only in the case of Sarah and Abraham, but you see it later with Hannah. She prayed for a child. Verse 21, she entreated the Lord. Isaac prayed for her because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated by him, or prayed to by him, and it said that Rebekah, Isaac's wife, conceived, verse 21. Now, years pass, but there's an interesting incident. While she was still expecting, God says to Abraham not only what the children are to be, but he tells them that there's going to be some antagonism in the future, not only between them, but also between their descendants. Look at verse 23. The Lord told her, Rebekah, there are two nations in your womb. I thought you said there were two people. Well, there were two boys in her, and that's it. But when you're talking about Israel, you're talking about not just a man, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. When you talk about Israel, you're talking about a nation of people. That's what we're talking about here, spelled out for you. Two nations are in your womb. Two manner of people. And they're going to be separated from, I like the word body here better than bowels. Our term bowels today usually means to most people your intestines, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about your middle section, your stomach, your belly. your womb, but it said your bowels. And one of the reasons for that is because that's the way the ancients viewed it. They viewed this as a seat of your emotions. I've described it this way. I think it's a pretty good description. If you ever, maybe you remember back when you were a child and you got into a swing and it was about 10 feet down from the crossbar at the top. In other words, you can get a big swing on that thing. We used to swing and then get at its very apex, then we would jump out and see who could land the furthest. But as you're swinging and you go up and you stop and all of a sudden you come down and you go, your stomach feels fluttery. That's the seat of your emotions. Well, that's what they thought. They used that term, the seat of the emotions, and they called it the bowels. I don't really know how the Greek would help you here, where it's translated splagna, S-P-L-A-G-N-A, splagna. But anyway, the seat of a person's emotions is what we're talking about here, and not their intestines. Okay, anyway, Isaac prayed. God answered. She conceived not one son, but two. She was pregnant with twin boys. Now notice, a problem soon develops. This is what I was talking about a moment ago. You think everything is going just right, and then something happens. Well, what's going on with her? Well, in her womb, there seemed to be a conflict going on between those two boys. Probably she was having fetal movements from the two fetuses. And I'm guessing that it looked like a struggle was taking place in her womb. She was thinking, what in the world is happening here? What's going on? Nobody had the answer. Her handmaiden didn't. Probably, maybe they may be like some people today and have their answers, but they don't know what they're talking about. So she asked God what's happening. And he gives an answer. Notice he says in verse 23, there are two nations in your womb, and they are quite different from each other. So the nurse didn't know, the husband didn't know. The struggle that was going on inside her was prophetic in nature. God, of course, knows the end from the beginning. And so he told her, there are two nations in your womb. How do you know that? Well, he's God. Two nations are in your womb, and there's going to be a lot of problems between those two nations. And that's exemplified by what's going on right now in your womb. And he even gets more specific. He says that one of those children is going to be more spiritually minded than the other. You ever see that happen in today's world? Well, sure you do. One child is much more concerned about spiritual things, more about what the Bible says. Another one could care less what the Bible says. He's more interested in the Dallas Cowboys. So he doesn't, well, I use the expression, he doesn't have a spiritual bone in his body. The Bible says he was profane. What does it mean to be profane? To be not spiritually minded. That's what you have in your womb, Rebecca. And we know from history that which started there in her womb carried right on for hundreds of generations. But God said the younger is going to be the leader. The older child is going to, the elder is going to serve the younger. How much time was there between the birth of these two boys? I know it wasn't hours. In fact, I'm pretty sure it wasn't even minutes. I think it was more like seconds. But one was older than the other. We know that. How much older? Don't know for sure, but it's not much older, probably just a matter of seconds. Why? Because notice the birth process. Starting verse 24, when her days were to be delivered were fulfilled. Now we're 9 months have passed by already. Boy, time passes fast. It does when you're studying the Bible too. Time passes, and behold, the twins were in her womb, and the first one came out red, like a hairy garment all over it, and they called his name Esau. More on that in a moment. After that came out his brother. How long after? It doesn't say, but let's continue reading, keep it in context. After that, the brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. Hey, we've got just a few seconds involved here. His hand was on Esau's heel, and he was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And then years pass, and the boys are all up in years. But let's zero in on verse 25 and 26 just a moment. Whenever God said that the older shall serve the younger, he's saying Esau's descendants are going to serve Jacob's descendants. Now, as in every case, when God makes a decision, that means other people are also affected. I mean, when God decides Jacob is going to be the one, what does that tell you about Esau? That he was not selected. That doesn't mean he's lost eternally. All that means is that he is not selected by God to serve in the line of the Messiah that's coming in the future, some 1850 years in the future. So we're not condemning anybody to being lost. We're just simply saying God chose one over the other. That's what it means when it said God loved Esau and hated, God loved Jacob and hated Esau. He loved him less. He chose Jacob. He did not choose Esau, the older of the two boys. Okay, now that's caused some people to be very concerned because, you know, the firstborn is the one supposed to get everything, or at least double of what the other child is going to get. But that doesn't necessarily limit God. For example, in the line of the Messiah, how many, there are a few who were not firstborn. For example, how about Seth, Adam and Eve's boy? He was son number 3. So he wasn't the firstborn. What about Isaac? Abraham's firstborn was Ishmael. But when God selected Sarah, that simply meant that it can't be Keturah or anybody else. When God makes a selection regarding the messianic line, that's all that we were emphasizing. So not only is that true regarding Jacob, who was not the firstborn, it's also true regarding Judah. Who's the firstborn in Jacob's family? Reuben, not Judah. Who's firstborn in David's family? It wasn't David. David was number 9, I believe, the 9th child. So God will select who he will. In fact, the Bible very bluntly says, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And when you select Isaac, that eliminates anybody else. Okay, now, God can do what he wants to do, and he can take care of these situations. I personally think it had been so much better if Sarah had not come up with this harebrained idea of Abraham having a child through her handmaid. God can take care of it. He said it's going to be this way. Leave it to God. When people start thinking, I need to help God out in this matter, that's a no-no. God doesn't need that. Okay, now, what happens to Rebekah? The Bible does not say. I wish they were, I don't know how many times I've made this statement. I wish the Bible had a lot more to say about any given subject. I'm left to wonder. But what does Rebekah say about all this that's transpired? Because that's God talking to her, Rebekah. I imagine probably at night when they went to bed, that she said, I need to tell you something, honey. What? Today God appeared to me and told me this. The younger is going to rule. The older is going to serve the younger. She probably told that to Jacob, also her son, after he was grown up a bit. Maybe she even told it to Esau. I don't know how many she told about what God said. I'm glad it's in the Bible, though, that we know what God had told her. Favor Jacob, not Esau. But have you noticed how many people down through the years have been just the opposite? How many times we see that in today's world, and we've pushed it over into politics now. In today's world, we call it anti-Semitic. But it's the same thing. People deciding that they know best, regardless of what God says about something. Okay, anyway, in the birth process, Esau is born, and as he's born, Jacob's hand takes hold of Esau's heel. I don't know what she thought. If she's probably having such birth pains and she wasn't thinking about what that would mean. But that term, Jacob means heel catcher, or I like the term heel grabber. They just named a child after that process. The heel grabber was Jacob. And of course, by extension, that means supplanter. And he did. He supplanted his brother Esau as far as the promises were concerned, especially that promise of Christ coming. Years passed. Verse 27, the boys grow up. Esau is a hunter, a man of the field. Jacob is a plain man. I don't like that word, plain. Do we have any other versions here with a different word? Verse 27.
Mild.
What?
Mild.
Yeah.
Like King James says.
Even the New King James will have something different here than the King James. But instead of a plain man, I think what we're talking here about is a complete, final, more mature man. It's the same word that's used. This is a compliment instead of sometimes, well, that's just plain old Joe, you know. That's not a put down. This is a term, like in Job chapter 1 and verse 8, it's exactly the same word in Hebrew. Y'all, what does it mean? The Bible says that God called him a perfect and upright man. Perfect is the same word describing Job as he's describing Jacob. Maybe that'll help us understand what is meant by that term plain. But anyway, one was a outgoing, and then of course Esau not only was a hunter, but he was a profane man, unspiritual, not spiritually minded at all. And Jacob was one that was dwelling in tents and a more mature fellow. Isaac preferred his oldest boy, Esau, because he said he ate his venison. He would go out and shoot deer, and then Rebekah, she helped prepare that meal, but Rebekah preferred Jacob. They were split. Look at verse 29. And Jacob sod pottage. What do you do when you sod pottage? Now, I know a number of years ago, I sodded my front yard. I put down Bermuda grass. I was sodding my yard. But when you sod pottage, well, just draw a line through sod, because that's not what that word simply means is he cooked some stew. Now, the brother was out. He comes in and he said, verse 30, Jacob, let me have some of that pottage. I am extremely hungry. I am faint, he said in verse 30. Give me some of that red pottage. Lentils were red. And so that's the reason that he's called Edom. The Edomites came from Esau. This is a good place for us to quit. We'll pick up there next Lord's Day. Thanks for your attention.
I'm gonna tell Wayne you said that. I think he's so hot there. This week, Barbara. Well, I'm doing good. That's her name. Do well, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I just left it over. It's 30 All right.